Germany declared war on the United States on December 11th, 1941, and in many ways that's seen as sort of an unavoidable response to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, but the German declaration of war didn't actually mention the Japanese at all. Instead, it listed 3 United States destroyers, the USS Greer, the USS Kearny, and the USS Reuben James, as reasons that Germany was going to war with the United States. Those 3 ships, and what at the time were called incidents, represent a nearly forgotten part of U.S. history, and that is the undeclared war that came before the Second World War. It is history that deserves to be remembered. By the mid-1930s, war clouds were already on the horizon throughout the world. In the United States, the prevailing mood was isolationism and non-interventionism. The U.S. involvement in World War I had been costly, and the national attitude, and the attitudes of powerful members of Congress, was that the U.S. must be prevented from being dragged into another European war. The Congress passed neutrality acts starting in 1935, intended to prevent the nation trading with powers at war. But the 1930s, starting with the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in October 1935, would test the nation's ability to remain neutral in a time of conflict. The slow drift towards war accelerated after the September 1st, 1939 German invasion of Poland. The invasion, ostensibly predicated over a dispute regarding the free city of Danzig, had sparked a broader war. France and Britain had joined military agreements with Poland, largely in an attempt to force a diplomatic solution. But when diplomacy failed and Germany invaded, both were obliged to enter the war. Roosevelt understood that the outbreak of war would include, as it had in World War I, a conflict over shipping in the Atlantic. Despite the isolationist attitude at home, Roosevelt wanted to help Britain as much as possible, without outright violating neutrality. On September 5th, Roosevelt announced an air and sea neutrality patrol. He claimed that the intent of the patrol was to monitor the actions of belligerent ships, and October 7th was joined by the foreign ministers of the American republics in what was called the Panama Declaration, which designated a patrol zone that extended between 200 and 300 miles from the shores of North and South America. The patrolling was done by a task force that included both the Navy and the Coast Guard. If the patrols sighted a U-boat, they were not allowed to attack, but they could monitor and radio its location to British and Canadian forces. In addition, Roosevelt convinced Congress to amend the Neutrality Act to allow so-called cash and carry sales. This provision allowed the sale of goods to a belligerent nation so long as they picked them up from an American port and transported them themselves. In theory, this allowed sales to both sides without threatening neutrality, but as Britain had a large enough navy to prevent German trade, the provision in practice only helped the Allies. U.S. neutrality was looking less and less neutral. The boundary was further tested in September 1940 when Roosevelt signed an executive agreement with Britain called Destroyers for Bases. The agreement traded 50 older U.S. destroyers to the British in exchange for land rights on certain British possessions. The destroyers taken from a reserve fleet were outdated, they were in poor repair, and of little use in the ongoing battle to protect shipping in the Atlantic. In fact, Churchill saw them as virtually useless, but agreed to the deal since he knew that U.S. support was needed after France had fallen to Germany in June. The base's rights supposedly enhanced U.S. defense, but the agreement really allowed the U.S. to take up some defensive responsibilities for places like the Bahamas, freeing Britain to redeploy troops to the war, as well as to allow the U.S. to finance base improvements like airfields that could then be used by the British. Again, Roosevelt was overtly helping the Allies while still pretending neutrality. But cash and carry was pressing its limits, as Britain, who with its empire was bearing the weight of the conflict after the fall of France, was running short of assets that could be used to provide the cash. Churchill sent a 15-page letter to Roosevelt, which was ironically delivered on December 7th, 1940, pressing for help. U.S. opinion was slowly shifting, but not to the point of supporting war. However, the nation was becoming more positively disposed towards Britain. Providing aid was seen as a way to fund the war against Germany without having to fight it ourselves. In March, FDR signed the bill that was popularly called Lend-Lease. The act allowed the U.S. to provide billions in aid, initially to Britain and China, making the U.S. an indirect participant in the war. Lend-Lease was extended to the Soviet Union after Germany invaded on June 22nd. As the Lend-Lease aid represented a substantial investment, Roosevelt then had a reason to extend the Neutrality Patrol to protect that investment. In July, the U.S. agreed to take over the occupation of Iceland, an agreement that required a formal request from the government of Iceland, which again allowed a redeployment of British troops, but also further extended the U.S. zone in the Atlantic. Eventually, the zone for the Neutrality Patrol extended 3/4 of the way across the Atlantic. Well, technically, under the terms of the neutrality treaty, U.S. forces were not allowed to attack Axis forces without being shot at first. The U.S. was, in practice, doing convoy escort, a crass violation of neutrality. The U.S. was, in essence, fighting an undeclared war. On April 10th, the Gleaves-class destroyer USS Niblack was picking up survivors from a Dutch ship that had been sunk by a U-boat when it got a sound contact that suggested that a submarine was, according to the action report, rapidly approaching a position for attack. The Niblack released a depth charge over the target. That attack appears to have been the first action between the United States and German forces in the Second World War. 8 months before war was officially declared. U.S. public support had significantly shifted by mid-1941. A Gallup poll showed more than 2/3 thought it was more important that Germany be defeated than that the U.S. stay out of the war. U.S. merchant vessels were being attacked, both under U.S. and Panamanian flags, and U.S. warships were escorting convoys through combat zones. It was only a matter of time before U.S. warships found themselves in the fray. On September 4th, 1941, the USS Greer, a Wickes-class destroyer, was carrying mail and passengers to Iceland when it was informed by a British plane that a suspected U-boat was operating in the area. The submarine was the U-652. Following the terms of the Neutrality Patrol, the Greer located the submarine using sonar and broadcast its location to British and Canadian units, but did not attack. The Greer pursued the submarine for nearly 3 hours when, according to the U.S. Navy, the U-652 made a torpedo attack upon the Greer, which detected the torpedo launched by sonar. The torpedoes missed, and the Greer then proceeded to attack the submarine with depth charges. While the Navy initially said the outcome was undetermined, the U-652 survived, fought on until June of 1942. Roosevelt described what was called the Greer incident as an unprovoked attack, saying in a broadcast on September 11th, "I tell you the blunt fact that the German submarine fired first upon this American destroyer, without warning, with the deliberate design to sink her." He even declared the attack an act of piracy, because don't all great stories involve pirates? The German response was to claim that the Greer attacked with depth charges first, and that the submarine fired in self-defense. It's still not proven who fired first. It's possible that the U-652 mistook depth charges dropped from a British plane as coming from the Greer, but as critics noted at the time, the Greer had pursued the submarine for nearly 3 hours before the torpedo attack, something which would normally be considered a hostile act. Still, the Greer incident led Roosevelt to declare a new policy called shoot on sight. He opined, "When you see a rattlesnake poised to strike, you do not wait until he has struck before you crush him." Under the new policy, if German or Italian warships were sighted in waters we deem necessary for our defense, the U.S. ships would attack them. The following month, the USS Kearny, a Benson-Livermore-class destroyer, was docked at Reykjavik when a nearby British convoy was attacked by a wolf pack of German U-boats. On October 17th, the Kearny and 3 other destroyers responded, and following the shoot-on-sight rules, attacked the submarines with depth charges. During the fight, the U-658 fired a spread of 3 torpedoes at Kearny, one striking her amidships. While the crew was able to control the flooding and withdraw, 11 crew were killed and 22 injured. These were American combat casualties, nearly 2 months before the U.S. officially entered the war. 10 days later, Roosevelt addressed the nation by radio on Navy Day. He said, "We have wished to avoid shooting, but the shooting has started, and history has recorded who fired the first shot. In the long run, however, all that will matter is who fired the last shot. America has been attacked. The USS Kearny is not just a Navy ship. She belongs to every man, woman, and child in this nation." 2 weeks later, on October 31st, the Clemson-class destroyer USS Reuben James was escorting a convoy when they got a high-frequency direction-finding, or HUF-DUF, contact indicating a German submarine. The Reuben James moved to put herself between the suspected U-boat and the convoy and was struck by a torpedo fired by U-552, and apparently intended for one of the convoy's ships. The torpedo detonated the ship's forward magazine, blowing the bow off the ship. Chief Petty Officer William Bergstresser told the St. Petersburg Times, "I went topside and found that the whole forward part of the ship, including the bridge, was completely demolished and carried away." The bow section sank immediately. The stern section sank 5 minutes later. 100 members of the crew were killed, including all of the ship's officers. Reuben James was the first U.S. Navy ship sunk by hostile action in the European theater in World War II, and the worst single U.S. naval disaster since the sinking of the battleship Maine in 1898. The sinking starkly represented the fact that the Battle of the Atlantic was being fought even though war had not been declared. The New York Times noted that the sinking brushes away the last possible doubt that the United States and Germany are now at open war in the Atlantic. Folk singer Woody Guthrie immortalized the sinking in a song released in 1942. Have you heard of a ship called the Good Reuben James, manned by hard-fighting men of both honor and fame? She flew the stars and stripes of the land of the free, but tonight she's in her grave at the bottom of the sea. Tell me, what were their names? Tell me, what were their names? Did you have a friend on the Good Reuben James? The sinking of the Reuben James emboldened those members of Congress that were pressing for war. Texas Senator Tom Connally said, "This unjustified and dastardly sinking must be avenged." But the isolationists blamed Roosevelt. Vermont Senator George Aiken said that Roosevelt was personally responsible for the casualties. The sinking of the Reuben James might well have been that event that shifted public opinion and allowed FDR to take us to war, but the Japanese took away any need for that discussion when they bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Still, the incidents with the Greer, Kearny, and Reuben James were a casus belli for Germany. In their declaration of war against the United States on December 11th, German Foreign Minister Ribbentrop cited the shots fired by the three destroyers as open military acts of aggression and argued that the government of the United States has thereby virtually created a state of war. And of course, the Germans were absolutely right. The neutrality patrol was never neutral. FDR always intended to go as far towards intervention as the public would allow without destroying this fiction of neutrality. But FDR also argued that the United States would be in desperate shape if England were to fall and the Axis were to take all of Europe and Asia, and there seems to be a fair point of discussion there. Perhaps the question shouldn't be, was this undeclared war neutral? Because obviously it wasn't. The question was neutrality ever a viable option? And questions like that will keep historians busy for as long as we study history. But what is not a question is that the casualties of this undeclared war deserve to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.